Anyway, welcome, and I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Ben Pelka, and I've been involved in RCIA for over 20 years as a sponsor, as one of the coordinators, and also as a catechist. And for the last 2 years, Gary McCullum and I have been called to be advocates for the tribunal and sanctioned by Bishop Soto, and our function is to help out in any of the marriage issues that we have here at our parish, or they can also be sent to us from other parishes. So the first thing I want to talk about is, since we're going to be talking about marriage and family, what catches your eye on the news all the time is there's a crisis. And indeed, I think there is. And it was kind of brought to my attention the other day. My wife sent me an article because Babies R Us, Toys R Us are closing up. And I'm thinking, that's Amazon, that's just the internet imposing on the brick and mortar stores. But the Colson Center published this article, and it looked pretty interesting. Back in 1965, you had the silent generation that was between the ages of 21 to 36. 80% of those people were married. Now we fast forward to the millennials, only 37% are married. And so you say, well, Ben, you know, that's okay, but we still have cohabitation. And I'll agree, back in 2016, we had 18 million people cohabitating. So there still are couples. But then we look at the fertility rate. And the fertility rate is 1.77 children per woman. That is way below our replacement rate. You look at Japan. It's not just our country. Japan, in 2010, said we are now 1 million people less than we were before. Their population has shrunk that much. In the United States, U.S. Census Bureau says in 2035, we're going to have more senior citizens than we have children. It's never happened before. I think that when you look at what marriage and having children does, it takes you into a different arena of your life. You start thinking about saving. You start thinking about investing. You start thinking about sacrificing. You start thinking about deferring gratification. You know, I'll do that when I retire. It takes the person, the parent, from being self-centered to other-centered. It's quite the big deal. So the first thing, though, we have to look at when we're going to talk about this is who has the authority to talk on it. You know, certainly I don't. Does the government have the authority? Who has the right to define it, and who has the authority to speak about it? So we'll look back at July 25th, 1968. Pope Paul VI came out with his encyclical, and that's just a letter. It's called Humanae Vitae. And it was on marital love, procreation, and artificial contraception. Rocked not only things in the church, but outside of the church. Because you got to remember, at that time, we had the whole scare about overpopulation. I had a professor in college that was a big thing with him, that he was concerned that he got kicked out of Mexico for teaching, you know, about contraception down there. And we're just going to overpopulate, and the world's going to end. We also had the start of women's lib. That was a big movement. And then the big one of all, we had the sexual revolution. We had free love. You know, woman takes the pill, you know, everything's fair game now. So the Pope was talking, and he was very prophetic. He said, you know, you're going to see increased infidelity, promiscuity. Women, you're going to lose your reverence for women because you're going to objectify them. And he said one other thing which really happened not too many years back. He said, be careful that you don't let the public authorities into the reproductive area of your life. And I think we saw that with the Affordable Health Care Act. The big cry at the time, and I'm sure a lot of you remember it, was, hey, you can't make the rules if you don't play the game. Little guy in Rome with the white, coat and shoes. And I always thought that was stupid. Because, my wife and I both had rotator cuff surgeries done. And I did not ask the surgeon from the Sacramento Kings, did you have rotator cuff surgery? Are you qualified to do this? I did. People came to me with infections and problems, and I could diagnose that tooth had gone non-vital and it needs a root canal. No one ever asked me if I've had a root canal. I've never had one, but I could diagnose them and do them. So that argument to me never held water. But why does the church have the authority to teach on marriage? Because Jesus Christ gave him that authority. When he told them, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He gave him the authority. And he is the author of life. He said in John 14:6, I am the truth, the way, and the life. So it comes back to Jesus again. So either he's a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's God. And I think that's the basic decision that we all have to make. And, as we look over the year that some of you have traversed in learning about your faith and coming into the church, you've had to make that basic decision. If he's God, then indeed I have to do something. I have to react to that. Then he really is who he says he is. And actually, he's the only person of a major religion that I know of that claimed to be God. So that's where the church gets its authority. And we also talked about infallibility. The church will not err on faith and morals. We don't have to listen to the Pope or the magisterium when they talk about the Cardinals are going to win the World Series this year. We don't have to believe any of that. But faith and morals, the church has not erred in 2,000 years since Christ walked on this earth. And it will not err because we have the Holy Spirit is guiding the church. It's not the Pope talking. It's the Pope in communion with the bishops. That's the magisterium. That's the teaching authority of the church, along with Scripture and tradition. It's three legs, and they never contradict each other. So that's where the authority comes from. A lot of times, though, you're going to hear that, well, the Catholics are sticking their nose into politics. And really what it is they're politicizing faith and moral issues, and they're being dragged into politics. So I think now let's take a look at life and marriage. So what's the purpose of life? We've talked about vocations before. And that would be maybe with a capital V we'll use on that, okay? So the vocation, we've got priests, deacons, we've got other religious life brothers and sisters. That's one vocation. We got some people that are called to just a single life. Other ones are called to married life, and that's what we're going to talk about. So what's the purpose of married life? There's two. The first is it's a unitive love that is ordered for the fulfillment and sanctification of the two spouses. Like it or not, we were created by God as a unique individual. There will never be anybody else like you. There's never been anybody else like you in the past. And you have a unique mission that God created you for. So that part of fulfillment, my job with my spouse is to help her do His will, what she was created to do on this earth. She is to do the same for me. The other thing is, my job is to help her get to heaven. And she does the same for me. So that's the first part. It's this unitive love. The second part is procreation and education of the offspring. Now, a lot of times we delegate that education off to schools. Here at St. Mel, they also get the religious education. If they're not going to a Catholic school, then you'll send them to CFF for that education. But make no doubt about it, where the education starts and ends is in the house. Bottom line. Do we have to educate children on marriage? Yeah, we need to. We hope that's done between the husband and the wife, and they get to see what that marriage is like and how mom loves dad and dad loves mom and how they respect and treat each other. But we have a lot of single family homes through divorce, through one of the parents dying. We also have dysfunctional homes. So a lot of these children today certainly need some education on marriage. Families are the fundamental building block of our society. A society breaks down as soon as the family starts falling apart on a major level. And that's something we really have to be careful about these days in our society. The church tells us, what do they call the family in the Catechism? You guys remember that? The domestic church. Okay. Brenda talked a couple of weeks ago about theology of the body, and I'm sure she covered this. The family mimics the Holy Trinity. Remember, the Father so loved the Son, and the Son so loved the Father, that love was so strong it became manifested not just as something, it became actually a person, the third person of the Blessed Trinity, the Holy Spirit. Marriage is the same thing. The Father so loves his wife, the wife so loves the Father, that their love, that unitive love, is manifested as children. So that's what the purpose of marriage is. Now let's talk about the institution, definition, and why it's a sacrament. Where'd that come from? So let's look at Genesis 1:27-28. It says, God created them in the image and likeness of God, male and female. He blessed them and commanded them to be fruitful and go forth, multiply and fill the earth. He blessed them. Isn't that interesting? Because isn't that what we come to church for our marriage, to get it blessed? That's where the sacrament was instituted. But where did he define it? Genesis 2:24, he says, this is why a man leaves his mother and father and clings to his wife, and the two become one. That's the definition of marriage. There has to be the complementary elements of the two sexes. Because if you don't have that, it's pretty impossible to fulfill the other part of marriage, which is procreation. And we're not going to go any further into the so-called same-sex marriage, but that's where it would be viewed as not compatible with marriage. And then the wedding feast of Cana, and you all know that one, Christ changed water into wine. That's where we said he instituted the sacrament of marriage. If we're going to look at what are the attributes of a true marriage, the first thing is, does it have the elements of the marriage? Is it a man and a woman? What type of love is it? Christ said we need to love as he loves. So it's this unconditional love, and we called that love, remember the Greek word for it, agape? It is that unconditional love. There's another element to it, that it's not a contract. We contract a marriage, but it's not a contract, it's a covenant, right? So you've got, Jenny, I like your car down there. I will give you $50,000 right now for your car. And Jenny's saying, so I made an offer. Jenny's accepted my offer. I'm going to write a check. I give her money. She gives me the title. It's a contract. A covenant is totally different. A covenant is an exchange of persons. I tell my wife, I give myself to you wholly, unconditionally, fully to you. And she says the same to me. And that's it. We are of equal dignity in that marriage. We freely give ourselves to each other. It is for the good of both spouses. And it's indissoluble. You cannot dissolve marriage. You make the pledge unto death, and once that marriage is consummated, it's irrevocable. You cannot dissolve it. And the last attribute of a marriage is that it's free and open to children. May not necessarily end up with children, but it has to be free and open to that element in the marriage. Okay. Now, for probably the part that you guys wanted to hear the most. Canon Law. What do we get involved in? Is a canon is what? What did we say a canon was? Like a canon of Scripture. It's a body of work. I think we could probably say the IRS code is a canon of law. A guideline, yeah. The whole summation of something. So we have that in the church. And it was last revised in 1983. So that is the revision we are still working under. The first one I want to bring your attention to is Canon 1055, Section 1. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. So, break it down. What are you talking about? Matrimonial, it's a covenant, right? By which a man and a woman establish. It's the only sacrament that we give to each other. I give it to my wife, she gives it to me. Father is just there to witness it for the church and give the blessing of God on the marriage. But we actually perform the sacrament. And it's a partnership for what? The whole of life. And it's ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of the offspring, and Christ raised it to the dignity of a sacrament. That's the basis of what we look at to define a marriage. There are three types of marriages, though, I'm going to tell you, that we consider. One is a natural marriage. Two unbaptized people, or it could be a baptized and an unbaptized, but as long as they're not two validly baptized people. So they meet on a cruise, and they're going for 2 weeks, having a great time, and they fall in love, meet this great girl, and oh my gosh, fall in love. And while we're down in Belize, let's get married. So we're going scuba diving. We're down 20 feet, and we've got those nice masks that we can talk, you know. So we're down there, and we've got our scuba instructor, and he's qualified to marry us. He has the faculties from Belize to do it. And we've got two witnesses. I'm married, and that's a valid marriage. That is a natural marriage. We don't care if they were skydiving and they did that. They exchanged the vows, all the elements were there. It's a natural marriage. So when people come to us, like in RCIA or whatever, and they say, oh, no, I wasn't married before. It was just a thing in Las Vegas or Reno. No, I'm sorry. It's kind of a valid marriage as long as everything's there. So, but if you have two baptized people, then by its own nature, it's a sacramental marriage. So if you've got a Presbyterian that's baptized validly, and you've got a Methodist that's validly baptized in the Trinitarian formula, and one of them, of the couple, is coming into RCIA and coming into the church, I don't have to do anything. That is a sacramental marriage. It does not have to be convalidated. Okay, so that's a sacramental marriage. And then there's the third type is a Catholic marriage. My wife and I were both Catholics. We followed all the canonical form, and we were married in the church. And that usually is done for two Catholics with the Mass. Okay, let's look at where's 1056. Because unity and dissolubility are essential properties of the marriage contract, renders the marriage covenant invalid. For the same reason, civil divorce cannot dissolve the marriage bond, and a divorced person cannot enter in a new valid marriage while the former spouse is still alive. In fact, really, the person should not even be dating seriously until we can see if the marriage can be rendered invalid. But the essentials here are the unity. Remember we said, the two become one flesh. It's like at Mass, if you've noticed, especially you new Catholics. Father takes a little, he's got the wine in the cup, he's poured the wine in, now he pours a little bit of the water. That has many symbolic things going on there, but one of them is we're entering into the cup of Christ with them. So you put that wine and that water together, how do you separate it? You can't, okay? Once the couple is unified with their pledges and with the consummation, there's a unification. How do you separate that? You cannot separate it, okay? So those are the essential things. And the pledge is important. You cannot say what's becoming popular now, till we love no more. Okay? I mean, what is that? I mean, there's until I get tired of you, and then that's it. So that is another important canon. And there's only one more that we'll look at. And this is really important. It's Canon 160. Marriage possesses the favor of the law. Therefore, in a case of doubt, the validity of a marriage must be upheld until the contrary is proven. This is true even when contested. So when somebody comes to us and says, well, it was just this kind of marriage, scuba diving, it's still, we have to accept that as a valid marriage until we can prove otherwise. It's kind of like taking a look at this. The church says, hey, you guys tied the knot. There's two knots. Check it out. We tested it. That knot's real. But now we're going to take a look at maybe a marriage, and there really wasn't a covenant there. So what was thought to have been a covenant was never brought about. And that's what we have to look at. So we use the term annulment. I will use the term annulment. That is not actually a true term that we use or should use. The marriage is declared to be invalid, or what we get back from the tribunal is a decree of nullity. So that's what the paper actually says on top. Divorce is saying that you're dissolving something. We just learned you can't dissolve it. So divorce can dissolve things like the property. You can set up visitation rights or decide what happens to the children, or maybe the home you have in the mountains and things, but you cannot dissolve the unitive bond itself. An annulment actually means a wiping away. We don't wipe anything away. The ceremony, the relationship, the children do not get wiped away. The only thing that we have the possibility of doing is looking at the marriage and seeing if all of the real qualities of a marriage were there. And we tend to look at three areas. The first is an impediment. Were they both old enough? Did they have the proper age to contract a marriage? Was there another another marriage already in place, so that if somebody comes here and wants to get married by father, and they said, well, here, I was married once, I got my divorce, I'm ready to get married, my intended is Catholic, you kind of got to back off, because we've got to see if that other marriage was really valid or not. There can be disparity of worship. If I'm going to marry, my intended is a Jewish girl, I need to go through marriage prep classes. Normally Deacon Dave does those here. And I need to be instructed how to live out my life as a Catholic, but with a spouse that is not of my faith. And when all that's done, we will then send in and ask for a dispensation of cult from the bishop, and we get that, and you can be married in the church. But maybe that was never asked for, the instruction never took place. Holy orders. God forbid one of our deacons lose their wives. They cannot marry again. That was part of the vows that they took. You can't abduct somebody and take them and get married. That would invalidate it. You were married, and I want to get married again. I want to get married in the church. So I know a guy, and he's going to take care of my wife, my ex-wife. Okay? You can't do that. That's not good. And a boy shouldn't marry a sister, and the girl shouldn't marry your brother. And we have a whole thing of degrees of separation that we look at when we come into looking at bloodlines and that sort of thing for marriages. So those are what we call impediments. Now we have defects of consent. One of them might be an incapacity such as lack of reason. The person had no conscious awareness of what they were entering into. It could be a defect of discretion. We see those. Remember, I was on the cruise for 2 weeks, fell in love. How long was that courtship? And it was on a vacation. It was all good times. That would probably be a defect of discretion. The inability to assume obligation. Just psychologically, you never understood what marriage was. And sometimes we do, can call in psychologists to look at, usually the testimony. They don't necessarily have to meet with one of the people, but we can have psychologists called in for the tribunal. There can be defects of intellect, such as ignorance. I didn't know marriage was permanent. I thought there was an out clause somewhere to it. That's possible. Error. I thought it could be dissolved. Or fraud. I was a drug addict. And so let's stop at this point and take a look at that. Somebody says, oh, my spouse was, not faithful to me. Or I found out my spouse is a crack addict. And that's all well and good. That doesn't invalidate that marriage. But maybe if I look at the fidelity factor and I go back before, because I need to know what happened before the marriage. So we look back at that. Well, geez, Dad had this type of thing where he always kept somebody on the side. Okay? Maybe that's where this man learned that from. And maybe he didn't understand that fidelity was a huge part of marriage. And it can be that they hid the fact that he was an addict beforehand with drugs, sex, whatever. So those are the type of things that we get into. There can be defects of the will. Force and fear. What is that? Shotgun wedding? Yeah, can't have that, right? Things like conditioned consent. Maybe an arranged marriage. That would render a marriage invalid. Immigration reasons. I got married so I can stay in the country. That could render a marriage invalid. And then we also have another thing called defect of form, and that is maybe the witnesses weren't valid. You had a 10-year-old as a witness. Maybe the minister really wasn't a minister, had been thrown out of the church earlier, something like that, but somebody didn't have the faculty. So we have two different types of marriage things that we look at. Well, the three types of problems we look at, but they come in two forms to us. One can just be administrative. Some of those are very simple. The lack of form. I didn't get the disparity occult. Well, I can go ahead and take care of that, but also that could be grounds that the marriage was invalid, depending on how we look at that. But a lot of them end up being these formal cases, and those are times that we sit down, we don't see anything wrong with the form, but we start to see grounds for divorce. Remember, we talked about, like, due discretion, things like that weren't right. Lack of intent and reason and all of that. These end up being what we call formal cases. We establish the grounds. We get witnesses, we get statements, questionnaires are sent out, and we bring all of this together. Gary and I submit it to the tribunal. The tribunal reviews it, says all the elements are there for what we need. I get a letter says it's been accepted. At this point, it's turned over to Father Mark, who is our judicial vicar. Father Mark now looks at it from a lawyer's standpoint and says, yes, there are grounds. I think we can proceed and get the testimonies from the witnesses, and that all gets gathered, and then it goes to trial. There is one lawyer that is assigned as defender of the bond. That person's job is to argue that that marriage is valid. And another lawyer's job is to say, no, it's invalid. Remember where the proof is? The proof is you've got to show why it's invalid. Otherwise, that marriage possesses the favor of the law. So these go to trial, and then at the end, after they vote and everything, we get the verdict. It's either an affirmative, it's an invalid marriage, or it's a negative. It's a valid marriage. I'm sorry, there is no decree of nullity. Now, we can appeal that. We can go to San Francisco Diocese and appeal it. We can take it to Rome if we want and appeal it. The other thing that happens, and we've seen this, is as you go along and information's being gathered, testimony's being gathered, it's kind of like, okay, maybe it didn't come through on that, but there's other grounds that surfaced, and you can get the decree of nullity as you look at it, and actually it was something else that seemed to be the problem. But in any case, we can never guarantee a decree of nullity. Sometimes you tied the knot, and it's a knot. And so I think I'm going to give Jesus the last word, but I want to say marriage is a lot of things, but our decree of nullity is not a divorce. So I hope you understand, and I made that point abundantly clear, why you cannot dissolve that union. But in the handouts, I put about 10 of them back there. And so if we look at Mark chapter 10, verses 2 to 12. So the Pharisees are again trying to trap Jesus, aren't they? And the Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And he answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed man to write a certificate of divorce and to put her away." And remember, when they were wandering, the Israelites were wandering the desert. They were coming out of Egypt. They were wandering around for 40 years. Moses was trying to get them away from all the paganism and everything that they had learned from the hundreds of years there with the Egyptians. And they were a stubborn people. And in order to keep the peace, Moses pulling his hair out, You know, it's talking to God. God's kind of, you know, do what you got to do. That's Deuteronomy. That is the second law. It is not given by God. It was given by Moses. So Jesus continues. But Jesus said to them, for your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And in the house, his disciples asked him again about this marriage. Remember, these apostles were not the brightest guys around that he was starting the church with. And so they're in the house, and it's like, really? You know, is this what you're saying? You know, can you tell us any more? And he tells them. And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So I think I would tend to leave the final word with Jesus. And I thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Bob.
When talking about covenant, you didn't mention that. I always was taught that the covenant is the two people plus God.
Yes, God is the unitive factor in that. I mean, Carla and I always say that our marriage is really three. It's the two of us plus God. Yes, thank you, Bob. Well, thank you very much.